Well, thank you very much for coming. We're gathered here to discuss various scenarios and priorities for rebuilding Cuba, or helping rebuild Cuba after the Castro brothers are done with it. I personally propose a simple formula, and I have in the past and still do: let Cuba be Cuban. Let me explain. Castro apologists have painted pre-revolutionary Cuba as a repressive backwater that was rescued by the revolution. Not true. The Cuba that Castro took over in 1959 was one of the most prosperous and egalitarian societies of Latin America, ranking near the top in most socio-demographic indicators. For example, while it is widely known that Cuba's infant mortality is one of the lowest in the region today, pre-Castro Cuba had the best such rate in the region and ranked 13th in the world. It also had the third highest daily caloric intake, the fourth highest literacy rate, the second highest number of passenger cars per capita, and ranked fourth in the production of rice. The country was also culturally advanced before Castro seized power, with the third highest newspaper circulation per capita in Latin America. Cuba also had the largest middle class of its peers in the Western Hemisphere. In the 1940s and 1950s, the island had progressive labor, land tenure, education, and health laws that rivaled those of neighbors in the region. The 1940 Cuban Constitution established such labor laws as the right to work, a maximum 40-hour work week, 1 month of annual vacation, Social Security, and the rights to form unions and join unions. Indeed, by 1958, almost half of the Cuban labor force was unionized. What a tragedy that 5 decades later, the Castro Revolution is bragging about teaching children to read books that they aren't allowed to own, and that the singular achievement of its vaunted healthcare system is that it helped kill Hugo Chavez. It is difficult to believe that Raul Castro was appointed leader of Cuba 4 long years ago. In the weeks prior to Raul's accession to power, we hosted an event here at AEI to examine the ways in which the international community might support a genuine transition to economic and political freedom in Cuba. I opined then that we must be generous in supporting the economic recovery of Cuba, but we must recognize that the true economic liberalization is not possible, let alone sustainable, without profound political reform that empowers the individual, establishes the rule of law, and protects the political liberty and economic rights of every Cuban citizen. 4 years later, we are still waiting for a day when such support can begin in earnest, because the dictatorship has not given an inch in the last 4 years. Indeed, the half measures that Raul has imposed in that period, including a handful of rehashed reforms, demonstrate that his priority is holding on to power rather than sharing even a little bit of it with 11 million other Cubans. That comes as no surprise to us who have recognized that Raul is an ideological enforcer of the Castro Revolution and not a real reformer. Indeed, the average number of detentions of dissidents per month more than doubled in 2011 compared to the previous year, from about 150 to nearly 350 arrests meant to harass dissidents and silence dissent. Dissidents were hauled away by the dozens before and after and even during the recent papal visit, showing exceptional brazenness, abetted in part by the breathtaking cynicism of Cuba's cardinal. So meaningful international support aimed at helping Cuba rebuild and help Cubans rebuild their country and their family's future will have to wait a bit longer. But what happens while we are forced to wait? That is the question that we've asked our keynote presenter, Brian Latell, to answer for us this morning. In short, what will Raul leave behind when Venezuelan benefactor Hugo Chavez loses his bout with cancer and his successors are more concerned with their own survival than with Castro's? Is Raul capable of bold reforms that might put his hold on power in jeopardy? And alas, if Raul fails to do so, is there any other Castro acolyte who might at long last put the country's welfare ahead of the revolution? If anyone can educate us on this expansive topic in the 20 minutes allotted, it is Brian Latell. Dr. Brian Latell serves as Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami, where he writes a regular column on Cuba and teaches as an adjunct professor. During Dr. Latell's 35 years of service in the CIA and the National Intelligence Council, he advised the White House and other ranking American officials and members of Congress on Latin America. In the 1980s, he was at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and CSIS here in Washington, which is a little outfit that I still think is still open. Doors are still open. From 1990 to 1994, Dr. Latell served as the National Intelligence Officer for Latin America. He is author of the recent book, Castro's Secrets, The CIA and Cuba's Intelligence Machine, which is not available for sale in the lobby, but it's probably on Amazon, right? Yes. We have asked Brian to offer his views on what Castro will leave behind when he takes his leave of Cuba. Dr. Latell.
Thank you, Roger. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you again. Many old friends and colleagues. I appreciate this opportunity to talk again about the Castro brothers. I've been doing it for a long time, Roger. One of these days, maybe we can all graduate from this. I think some of you know my fundamental views about Raul Castro. I presented them in my previous book. It's called After Fidel. It was really the first biography ever written of Raul and a leadership psychological study of the relations between the Castro brothers. Some of the key things about Raul, I'll be very brief by way of introducing him. Some of the key things that you need to understand. He's been in charge now in Cuba, first provisionally, and since February '08, fully in charge as president. It's been 6 years that he's been running Cuba, pretty much on his own. His style is military. Raul Castro is Cuba's only four-star general. He is the leader of a powerful, well-disciplined, organized military. And every one of the three-star generals reports to him, salutes him. They're old friends. They go back, most of them, 50 years with Raul. So in this sense, Raul is very different from Fidel, who could never keep a team of people around him for very long. Raul, as a military man, a lifelong military man, by the way, he claimed in an interview a couple of years ago that he was the world's longest-serving defense minister. This was after he stepped down as Minister of the Armed Forces. I did some checking. I found it impossible to do a full check, but I think he's right. I think in all of human history, nobody served as a defense minister 49 years than Raul Castro, and he boasted of it. It might have been a little dig at his brother, who didn't last quite that long as the political chief of Cuba. So Raul's style is military. He delegates authority. He consults with the subordinates he really trusts, the 3 stars and the 2 stars, all of whom were selected by him, installed, and promoted by him. Raul fancies himself a problem solver, a military-style problem solver, and that's what he did at Fidel's side for all of those years when he was defense minister. He was the indispensable man in Cuba. Fidel Castro could not have lasted all of those years if he had not had Raul at his side, managing, organizing, administering, and running the armed forces, the most critical organization. And since 1989, all of the intelligence and security services as well. They since '89 have been under the command of the senior, most ranking 3-star general, who has been Raul's sidekick since 1958 or 59. It's a long time that they've worked together. Raul is vastly more pragmatic than Fidel. Raul has no interest in revolutionary circus or pageantry. Raul does not organize mass marches. I don't think there's been one since he took power 6 years ago. Certainly they're not going in front of the American diplomatic mission and waving flags and brandishing their fists and screaming. Raul's style is bread, not circus. His style is much more pragmatic. He's a cruel man, and there's a lot of blood on his hands, to be sure, and I document some of that in my previous book. But this is a man who's not as vengeful as Fidel. He doesn't hold the same kind of deep, visceral grudges. He's not a narcissist. His psychological makeup is vastly different than Fidel's. Fidel is a sociopath or a psychopath. Raul is essentially, psychologically, a pretty normal person, despite the blood on his hands. The economy, the Cuban economy, that's where we have to really start. It seems to me there are 4 economies now in competing on the island. There's the legal state-controlled economy, which is 95% of it. There's the new emerging private sector economy. There's a black economy, and there's a gray economy. I'll try to explain what I mean by the gray economy. That's the least intuitive to understand. Raúl, like Deng Xiaoping in 1979 when he began his reforms in China, Raúl felt he should start with agriculture. And certainly it made sense. It's one of the most disastrous, among the many disastrous areas of the Cuban economy. Huge, huge tracts of land through all the years of Fidel's government had fallen into disuse. Marabu is a vine. It's a very invasive vine that has covered vast agricultural tracts in Cuba that once were very productive. Raúl, when he took over in '06, he began talking in almost all of his speeches about the need for agricultural reform. After all, they were not producing much of anything on their own anymore. They were importing 60, 70%, some years even more, of the food that the Cuban people ate. They were spending a lot for it. They were using $2 to $3 billion of hard currency to buy the food, a lot of it from the United States. In recent years, we've been one of their major trading partners. Amazing. Paradoxical, isn't it? We have an economic embargo, but we've been one of their largest trading partners. So Raúl introduced a number of agricultural reforms, but they're cautious, they're moderate. They're not what Deng Xiaoping did. Raúl did not open agriculture to small farmers, to really vigorous, unencumbered private enterprise. He's leasing lands, these terrible lands that had fallen fallow. He's leasing these lands to Cuban farmers. There was an increase, a seemingly significant increase in agricultural production last year. It was up 9%, but it has to be looked at in context. It may have been that the production was up last year because there weren't any hurricanes that were devastating to agriculture. And even with a 9% increase last year, food availability was only about the same as it was in the year 2005. So the results so far are very mixed. And we can only say it's because Raúl has been too cautious. He hasn't been willing to go as far as the Chinese and the Vietnamese did in the early years of their reforms. Raúl followed the agricultural reforms with reforms in small services, allowing small enterprise to develop. First in barbershops and beauty parlors and corner fruit stands. And then more recently, last year, the government authorized 187 categories for free enterprise. Heavily taxed, they have to be licensed, they're monitored and watched, and the categories most people I know in Miami agree the categories are very, very limited. None of those 187 categories include anything in electronics, in internet, in anything innovative on the edge. None of these 187 categories for free enterprise are going to result in export efforts or export commodities. It's mattress repair and watch repair and sewings, fixing sewing machines. It's very, very small enterprise. But there's a gray economy that's developing on the side of this list of 187, and a black market economy that's developing on the other side. There's so much corruption on the island, and there's so much corruption within all of the state enterprises and the state institutions at all levels, from the top to the bottom. There's so much corruption that gray and black economies are beginning to develop. I don't know if they're thriving, but they're beginning to develop around these 187 categories. There are a couple of websites. Look at Cubísima or Revolico, revolico.com and cubísima.com. They're like Craigslist. You can go on those websites and you can buy almost anything. Well, not quite anything. You can buy a penthouse in Vedado for, they're asking $1 million, a million cooks, which is actually more than $1. $1 million for a penthouse in Vedado. There's been a lot of sales of homes and residences and cars. That was authorized not too many months ago. There have been, I don't know how many thousands of cars and residences that have changed hands, and money is beginning to flow. I mean, people in Miami, Cuban Americans in Miami who have a hand in this, a role in this new enterprise, are beginning to make some money, and they say that the sky is the limit. There are now about 370,000 Cubans who are engaging in this small licensed private enterprise. And the regime says that by the end of the year there will be 600,000. So it's not an insignificant number. Like in any budding capitalist system, there are a lot of failures. A lot of people are not making it in their small enterprises. A lot of people are giving up. A lot of people are saying the taxes and the government controls and the watches and monitoring is just too severe, and they're discouraged. But there are others who are doing very well. I mean, anecdotal and press accounts tell of Cubans opening small businesses who are doing very well, and they're doing well enough to open ancillary and secondary and other businesses with the capital that they've accumulated. There are a lot of Cuban Americans in the diaspora who are supporting relatives, helping them to invest in new businesses. Something to watch for. It's a cautionary. It's almost entirely light-skinned European-descended Cubans who are doing this. Afro-descended Cubans who are the large majority of the population, probably more than 60%. Very, very few of them are doing this. It's for a variety of reasons, but it's something that the regime may very well pay a price for, or the successors of the regime may have to deal with in the future. The regime says that 50% of the economy will be in private hands, cooperatives and small enterprise, in the next 4 or 5 years. They're not anywhere near that. It's proceeding very slowly and cautiously. The regime, especially the military and security men around Raul, who are his most trusted, oldest sidekick advisors, they're very worried about public security. When Raul said in a speech that he was going to lay off 1 million Cubans from state sector jobs, it really stunned the population, and Cubans were really, really worried about what was going to become of them, especially since many of them didn't have any desire to go into private enterprise. Well, Raul quickly backed off from that. He had to retreat, and I'm sure it was because of concerns about public security and public. He was worried about demonstrations. He was worried about maybe even another boat lift to Miami. If you suddenly lay off 1 million people who have lived for 40 or 50 years on the state dole, it can be very dangerous. The question marks, the instability could have been bad. So now they're saying 50% of the economy in private hands over the next 4 to 5 years, and it probably, if they last that long, it will probably take even longer. There are a lot of cautions here. The regime is just penetrated. It's pervasively corrupt, and at all levels of government, from the lowest level of government to the highest levels of government. Raul is waging a very concerted campaign against corruption, and hundreds of officials and several foreigners, foreign businessmen, have been arrested, have been rolled up in anti-corruption campaigns. There was a video that the regime made that was going around. They were showing it to government officials. They didn't want it getting to Miami, and they controlled access to it very carefully. It was called metastasis. It was the idea was how corruption was metastasizing throughout Cuban society. It's true. This was not an exaggeration. Now the other problem with implementing, institutionalizing these reforms, these economic changes, is that government institutions on the island are not up to the task of taxing, monitoring, licensing, and watching these changes as they occur. So that's resulting in more corruption, and also in a spreading of the black and the gray economies. By the gray economy, what I mean in one sense, just one example, is that the regime really is looking the other way now, beyond the 187 categories that it originally set out. The number of categories now has grown beyond the 187. So more Cubans are doing things that are not technically allowed, but authorities are looking the other way. I'm talking so fast, I'm not going to have enough to say for 20 minutes.
No, we're going to have some questions.
The reforms reforms that I've just outlined them. I've given you a sense of what they are. There are really a lot of other things that have been going on as well. These economic reforms that Raul has been implementing since he began talking about reformulating agriculture, restructuring agriculture. These reforms, you're not going to hear this from a lot of my friends in Miami or from my colleagues at the Cuba Studies Institute. But these reforms, in my opinion and my view, are the most meaningful, the most significant, the most comprehensive that have occurred in Cuba since the mid-1960s, 45, 48 years. These are the most meaningful, significant, comprehensive economic reforms. I think it would be a mistake to dismiss them or to underestimate their significance. And I'll explain what I mean. Cubans now, 375,000 of them now, maybe as many as 600,000 by the end of the year, and an ongoing yet more and more, are less dependent on the government. They're not getting the rations they used to. They're not getting the same kind of government subsidies that they were so accustomed to. They're working harder in private enterprise. Some of them are working themselves to exhaustion. And not a lot of them are getting rich, but some are. And those who are getting rich are a role model for others. Cubans are less dependent now on the regime. They're less sympathetic to the controls that the regime exercises over them. And more Cubans are seeing that this is a new and it's a vigorous reality. I think furthermore that, and this is important, these changes that are underway, I believe, are irreversible. Now, I guess we could all imagine a scenario in which another dictator comes after the Castro brothers and reverses all of these. You could even, I think you could even imagine some hardline Fidelista from his personal entourage who would somehow gain power and reverse all of these, because Fidel Castro doesn't approve of almost all of these reforms. In the 90s and in previous decades, when there was necessary experimentation with economic reforms, some of them very, very modest exemplars of the ones today, Fidel reversed them. As soon as the economy began to pick up a little bit, he reversed them and he shut them all down again. But I believe that these reforms that are underway now are irreversible, except in the most unlikely circumstances. The leadership is saying this. Machado Ventura, Jose Ramon Machado Ventura, the number two, the 82-year-old number two to Raul. He said it himself in a speech not long ago. These changes are permanent. They are changes meant to solve old problems. And Raul has used similar formulations to indicate that Cubans should expect this time that these changes will continue. They intend them to be irreversible. Furthermore, the nomenclatura, the leadership in Havana, understands all of this. They don't have any illusions about what they're allowing and what the implications, the longer-term consequences are likely to be. They don't have any illusions about it. And my guess, and I have to phrase it that way, my guess, my surmise, is that the nomenclatura overwhelmingly is on board with these changes. I don't know of any significant factionalism in the leadership over these issues. Put Fidel apart. Fidel and that little entourage around him in the convalescent quarters where he resides at Punto Cero, put them aside. I don't know of any factionalism, any divisions in the nomenclatura about any of this. Raul has no rival, and that's important to note. There's no rival to Raul as Cuba's absolute supreme leader. Some people say that Ramiro Valdez is such a person, but I really doubt that. Ramiro was historically a rival to Raul, but Ramiro doesn't control any troops. Raul controls them all. Another thing that could prove to be significant over time with respect to these reforms, members of the diaspora are beginning to get a toehold in the Cuban economy. It's a toehold. It's not much. It's very little. members of the diaspora are getting money to relatives on the island, and these relatives are beginning to develop small enterprise, very small enterprise, but some of them are growing. Members of the diaspora are able, and other foreigners are able to buy property now. Imagine if you're from Miami and you've been able to accumulate some wealth, you might be able to buy $1 million penthouse in Vedado. Maybe one of your relatives owned it before. It's a small change yet. It's really you really can't even chart it yet, I don't think, but it's one of the things that's going to be happening. And the leadership could shut it down, obviously, at any time. Maybe not entirely, but the leadership could react against it. But so far, I don't think they have. Now, finally, I think that, and this is the most important point that I'd like to make about the significance of these reforms of Raul Castro. These reforms, as I've hinted at already, they are systematically dismantling the Fidelista legacy. Raul stated it in a speech about a year ago. He stated it. It went unnoticed. It was just one phrase in a speech. He said, we must avoid paternalism, idealism, and egalitarianism. Now, if there are three words that sum up Fidel's domestic policies and domestic dogmas and priorities over the 48 years he was in power, it would be those three words: paternalism, idealism, and egalitarianism. Fidel never wanted one Cuban to have a lot more than another. He wanted an egalitarian state, which is why he kept shutting down the farmers' free markets over the years and shutting down free enterprise. I remember his campaign in the 80s, in the mid-80s, against, Fidel called it the rectification campaign. It was a response in part to perestroika and glasnost. He was arresting what he called neo-capitalist exploiters. There were people who would make jewelry out of junk that they got at in the garbage dumps, the people who would sell chocolate bars in Lenin Park, people who would go around and do caricature paintings of people in the parks. And these, for a peso or two, you would have your caricature painted. And Fidel condemned them. He specified a number of these people I just mentioned, specified. These are neo-capitalist exploiters. We cannot tolerate them. They will create an unequal society. We'll have a new class in Cuba, and that is not what this revolution stands for. And paternalism, what's that? That's the dole of the state. It's the state controlling everything. It's the state controlling 95% of the economy, as it still does. And what's the idealism? The idealism refers not just to domestic, but also to foreign policy, the revolutionary internationalism, and all of the things that Fidel considered to be his ideals. These are being systematically dismantled in Cuba today. Perhaps that's dangerous. Perhaps there'll be a backlash. I would look at 4 key variables looking out into the future, and then I guess I should stop talking. Huh?
Please, you're doing great.
Okay, a few more minutes. So these reforms, in my opinion, are very, very significant for all of these reasons. This is a new Cuba in some very, very significant respects. Now, politically, there's no new Cuba. I don't have to say that to this audience. There's no new Cuba. The repression is still about as absolute as it ever was. In style, Raul is somewhat different. Fidel, through all of his years in power, liked to conduct political purges. It was part of his Stalinist identity. Or Leninist identity. Fidel liked to have purges, political purges, and he did it with great frequency all through the years. I don't know how many purges there were, beginning with the sectarian purge in '62 and the microfaction purge in '68 and the purges of the '70s over idealism, the purges in the '80s of Minint and Minfar, Ochoa, De La Guardia executions, and all of those purges. Fidel liked to have circuses, create political circuses around his purges. Raul doesn't do that. Raul is firing people. He did this anti-corruption campaign, but he's not looking for scapegoats the way Fidel always did, and he's not waging these purges. But is there a hardcore Fidelista claque around the old, now decrepit, disabled leader? Is there a claque around him that could pose a challenge to Raul and to what Raul has been doing? It's possible. I don't know of any hard evidence of it. If you read Fidel's reflections, his editorials that are published pretty regularly, it's pretty damn impossible to find any criticism of Raul or the reforms. He talks, he ponders, he ruminates. He expounds on all kinds of exotic subjects, mostly foreign affairs. Hates Obama. He hates the United States. That's not changing in any respect. But could there be a claque, a hardcore cabal around Fidel? I don't rule it out because of what's happening to Fidel's legacy. Obviously, the Venezuelan subsidy is a key variable. I don't need to go into that. Another key variable on the opposite side, the obverse of the Venezuela, is offshore oil. Will they strike some real gushers in the next couple of years? Will the gushers be enough to counteract any loss of Venezuelan subsidies? Another key variable that I always, ever since my intelligence analysis days, another key variable that I like to keep in mind is this one: the attitudes of field-grade military officers. The generals are Raul's guys. They're old. They're in their 70s and 80s. They've been with him for decades. They live really well. They probably have foreign bank accounts, a number of them. It's very unlikely there's going to be a movement against the leadership from the senior ranks of the armed forces. They're all handpicked loyalists. But what about the field-grade officers, the majors and the colonels? And after all, for Cuban majors and colonels, lieutenant colonels, there's a model: Chavez. Chavez was a field-grade military officer when he tried to overthrow Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1992. And the Cuban government, the Cuban military, completely embraced this golpista, this field-grade military officer who waged a bloody coup. So there is a model. There's a reference point for younger military officers who might, for a variety of reasons, be concerned about the leadership. They remember the savagery, the unfairness of the Ochoa de la Guardia executions. General Ochoa was the most beloved, most honored military man in modern Cuban history, and he was put up against the execution wall on trumped-up charges of drug trafficking. Antonio de la Guardia was executed. He was one of Fidel's best intelligence officers, one of Fidel's favorites, and he was executed. Now, I think the real reason, I say it in the new book, I think the real overriding reason they were both executed is that they were contemplating defection. They were both contemplating defecting to the United States. I think those are some of the key variables. We could all come up with about a dozen others, but the changes in Cuba, just to sum up, the changes under Raul are significant. Raul was always underestimated. And after Fidel, my previous book, that was one of the principal themes of that book. Raul was always underestimated. Even in the CIA, we underestimated him. We believed that he was just a weakling, that Fidel controlled and dominated everything. We didn't understand how essential Raul was through all of those years to maintaining that regime. And I think it would be a mistake today to underestimate Raul. He may still, even at the age of 81 and with probable infirmities that could get him at any time, that could take him down at any time, don't underestimate him. He might yet have some surprising tricks up his sleeve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, could you stay up there, Brian? 'Cause
Yeah,
we're
sure.
going to have
Sure.
Q&A. I'm going to ask the panelists they have a couple of questions, but let me start by asking one. And I think it was a rather remarkable presentation. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
I'm sure the audience does as well. because it gives certainly another point of view and a learned one about what's happening there. You use the words meaningful and systematic. And one of the propositions that we'll discuss here is that to really have irreversible reforms, you need to have the rule of law and property rights. Nothing that I see from a considerable distance, granted, going on in Cuba today suggests that either one of those essential building blocks is in place. Am I wrong on that, or what would?
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. I think the Chinese and the Vietnamese have gone much further in terms of institutionalizing. I didn't mention the IRI poll, and I know there are some IRI people here. The IRI poll done last year, I think, is very revealing. If I remember, 88% of those polled are very happy with the economic reforms. They want more. 3 out of 5 Cubans, if there's an IRI person here who remembers the precise findings of that poll, please correct me. But I think 3 out of 5 Cubans in that poll said that economic change would have to be accompanied by major political change, structural change. My point is that I think this is what Cubans increasingly want. Mm-hmm. I think the nomenclatura knows this, and I think the nomenclatura is not yet resisting these important trends.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you said this, I think maybe a bit enthusiastically, with all due respect, the sky's the limit. To quote the great political philosopher Chris Rock, I mean, I guess he would say that the limit is the sky in Cuba for most Cubans.
It is over time.
Yeah.
Over time.
Let me ask panelists. Mark, you have a question for Brian?
Well, I guess I would take a slightly different take, or a different take on the nature of the reforms. But my question is, we've seen this type of thing in the past. I think you alluded to several examples in response, for example, to the special period where there was a loosening up on the economic front, only to have all of that rolled back once the Venezuelan subsidies returned and once sort of the Cuban economy got its head back out of the water thanks to international tourism and so on. What about this leads you to think that it's so irreversible? One, and also, do you therefore think that this is something that's being planned and strategized, or is this the regime reacting to events in an improvised way?
Yeah. Very briefly on your first question, Mark, I take the stand that I do on irreversibility because of the numbers of Cubans now engaged who are outside of the state sector, how the number is going to continue to grow, and how attitudes are changing. But your second question is one I did not address, and it's important. I don't know that I doubt that Raul has a really world-class economic team around him. I wrote last year about Marino Morillo. He's the supposed economic czar. A man of from what I gather, from what I've been able to learn, a man of quite limited abilities, especially limited theoretical abilities. I've done interviews with one of his, let me see, I have to protect my source. I did interviews with someone who knows him very, very well, whose identity I probably should not reveal. Someone who knows him almost like an uncle or a father figure. This source of mine told me Marino Morillo is just a middling bureaucrat. This is not someone with vision. It's not someone with great administrative capabilities. So I think that's, and this is Raul's hand-chosen guy. Raul chose this guy out of obscurity. I mean, Raul was in a meeting with vice ministers and bureau chiefs one day, and Morillo said something that impressed Raul. And suddenly he began rising meteorically, and he's now one of the highest level officials in the regime. But what's his competence? There's another man who's been rising rapidly in Murillo's wake, and that's Adel Izquierdo. And he might be better, but he's also a career military man. Izquierdo also came up through the ranks of the armed forces. And how do how iconoclastic, how innovative, how creative can you be if you've spent a life in the Cuban military? Probably serving in places like Angola and dusty Ethiopia, and helping the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. I mean, you don't learn economic reform that way. So the answer to your question is, that's a really good question, and the answer is, I think, still up in the air.
Certainly, if they're improvising at this point with the mess in Venezuela and their dependence on that oil and aid, they're in serious trouble if Chavez sings.
Absolutely.
Other question up here from the panel? We can go to the audience. Dale?
Brian, I still wonder personally how much of what we call the economic changes that are being implemented by Raul are in fact a reaction by them to legalize what was already occurring in Cuba. There were a number of the self-employment projects. I don't call them small businesses at all. I think they're aimed to become self-employment independent, some very more micro businesses that were already being funded for years by the U.S. government through USAID and DRL and the Cuba program and the diaspora. Thousands of these self-employment initiatives were already taking place in Cuba. And as I look at the trajectory of what took place, it seems to me that their great desire to legalize them so that they could tax them became a motivator. And so I'm still out in school as to how much strategically they wanted to do that versus how much he felt that they had to do it.
Yeah, well, I don't know. You may be right. It could be that this is all a Trojan horse, but I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's gone too far. I think popular expectations, have now over these 6 years been changed fairly fundamentally, and it's a very different international environment that Cuba has to operate in too. But no, I don't think so. I would just go back to what I said previously, Theo. I think that these are irreversible and enduring. And furthermore, my colleagues in Miami, at the University of Miami, they sure disagree with me. But I think furthermore that there are further changes, further reforms, accelerated reforms that are coming.
Well, let's throw it open to questions. Oh, I'm sorry. Francis, please. Sorry.
Reference the sort of the difference between the European Cubans and the non-European Cubans, and that the European Cubans were the ones that were more aggressive in terms of becoming entrepreneurs, getting money from their relatives in the West and so forth, and sort of alluded to the potential for problems when the economy does open up. What do you foresee as the main problems with this sort of underclass? Will they be able to make the adjustments, become more entrepreneurial, deal with the lack of paternalism?
It's the race problem. Let's just call it for what it is. The race problem in Cuba is grave, and it's getting worse. And everything that I cited positively is probably making the racial situation worse. The racism of the communist regime has been one of its unheralded, unknown, disguised characteristics. This has been a racist regime, as it's been a misogynist regime. There are almost no women and almost no blacks that are historically important in the Cuban leadership. Raul has made an effort to at least change the appearance of both of those. But I haven't been to Cuba now in quite a few years, since the early 90s, but I understand in tourism, European tourism, tourists are encountering European-descended Cubans, not Afro-descended Cubans. that Afro-descended Cubans are living in squalor in terrible slums in the cities and in the countryside. They're not getting remittances. The diaspora is overwhelmingly white. The diaspora must be what, 98% white, and if they're sending money to relatives, it's not the Afro-Cubans who are receiving it, either for their daily subsistence or for creating an enterprise. These problems persist, and I think they're getting worse. And some of the most heroic dissidents are Afro-descended Cubans. Some of the most heroic. Bisset is one in particular. So Afro-Cubans someday will inherit the political system because they're in a large majority. But getting from here to there is what we have to wonder how that's going to happen.
Excellent questions from the panel. Let's go to a couple from the audience. Ray Walser in the back. Please generally identify yourselves and your affiliation.
Hi, Ray Walser from the Heritage Foundation. And if I could begin with a couple of shameless sort of self-promotion announcements. First of all, on Friday at 11 o'clock, we will host Congressman Connie Mack and continue a discussion of centering on solidarity with the Cuban opposition. This is obviously a theme, and hope that you can join us at Heritage for that event at 11 on Friday. And secondly, if I may put in another plug, a save-the-date plug, that on May 31st at 1, which I believe is a Thursday, at 1 p.m., we're going to host the author Brian Latell and have a book event on Castro's secrets. So please put that onto your calendar. Brian, I think that the quick question I want to bring to you, and it was one I raised with you in Miami when we met a couple of weeks ago, is implications for U.S. Policy. And clearly you've opened up a scenario of a changing Cuba, which clearly leads those who favor engagement to say now is the time for the U.S. to jump in with both feet, to lift, obviously, restrictions, the embargo. We're seeing that remittances are probably the chief vehicle. Your discussion about corruption is how much money might even be flowing into the island in a fashion of corruption. So what do you recommend? Should we make a drastic change? Should we embrace these changes that are taking place on the island?
Ray, I've long supported the embargo. I don't like the embargo. I guess none of us likes the embargo. We have no international support. What, the Marshall Islands and Israel? But my position has always been, I would not give away the embargo without getting major concessions from the Cuban regime. Major concessions in human rights and democracy and political participation. It's just not negotiable in any other fashion, in my view. And if we can't get those kinds of concessions from the Castro brothers, then let's hold on to our leverage and use it with, not necessarily against, but use it in negotiations with their successors.
Other question, gentlemen here?
Retire from the IMF. Brian, of these future developments, there are a number of things that, to me, are obvious that need to be done. For example, more freedom in agricultural prices, less acopio purchases from the farmer, allowing more professionals to work on their profession. An engineer establishing a construction company, architects, a software engineer doing some internet work, and also eliminating the bias against employment. You know, as far as I know, they still have this maximum of workers that you can hire in your government, and on top of that, if you hire more than 6 or 7, then you have double taxation. They have a tax on labor use. I mean, those 3 types of reforms are low-hanging fruits if you really want to develop the private sector. Do you hear anything about those things?
Well, you know, they have, as I understand it, they have gradually and over several stages increased the number of employees that you can have if you're running a paladar. I think it may be even up to, it was originally just a few, and then it grew to 12, and I think it may be up to 50 now. So you know, there is more, in Marxist terms, class exploitation. the kind of thing that Fidel despises. There's a new class that has been emerging in Cuba now for several years, not just since Raúl's reforms, but the remittances that are sent from Americans, the Cuban exiles, it's probably $2 billion a year that gets back to Cuba that way. And as I said earlier, it's creating a new class. There are some economists, you all can correct me or please tell me better. There are some economists who tell me that the disparities of wealth and income in Cuba, counting remittances, the disparities that are greater than almost anywhere else in Latin America, between the richest and the poorest. Now, I have not been able, I can't independently verify it because, first of all, I'm not an economist.
But we only have time for maybe one more question. Jonathan?
Yeah, there's a lot of our friends in Miami, a lot of people think if President Obama gets reelected, that he's going to make a move in a second term to try to improve relations with Cuba, even talk about restoring relations, as president's second terms look for historical legacies. How would the Cuban government, I know, if Raul perceived that, with Fidel still hating Obama in the United States, what would they welcome that such an overture and change? But obviously, there'll be some preliminary talks, and if the Cubans aren't interested, it won't go anywhere. But I just want to see what you thought if that scenario occurs.
I don't think so. I think Alan Gross is the line in the sand for us, and for them, it seems that the really four now, are the line in the sand. And there's no comparison between these cases. There's no correlation. There's no compatibility. The five Cuban spies and the 24 others that assisted them. Some served shorter prison terms. Some fled back to Cuba by using their false identities and their illegal papers. There's no comparison between the 5 spies we've imprisoned and Alan Gross. He should be freed. But until he is, I don't think that Obama, even in a second term, or Romney or whoever, is going to make any significant move. Now, but in your question, there's the question of Fidel. And frankly, my hunch, and it's only that, my hunch is that Fidel still, from his convalescent quarters, exercises veto power, whether he can coherently express his view or whether it's being formulated by the little claque around him, I can't be sure. But I think Fidel is the one who's telling Raul, don't let Gross go. Keep him. I think it's Fidel. Bill Richardson was there, a few months ago. And Richardson had a similar impression. And Richardson came out, he had negotiated political prisoner releases before in Cuba. And he came out this time empty-handed, and he said, they don't want better relations. That's Fidel.
Yeah.
Was there one more?
You're about right. Richard, let's go ahead and take one last question. I'm sorry, I've just got to take one more, if it's...
Thanks, Roger. Richard Feinberg at University of California and Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks very much, Brian, for a very clear-eyed and realistic portrayal. And I agree with you, there's another series of reforms coming down the pipeline that will sort of fortify your assessment. But I was interested that you picked up this 50% in the private sector figure, which is something that was recently thrown out, I think, by a Politburo member. But that would be 2.5 million people for a workforce of 5 million, which seems very large. I mean, previously they were talking about 35%, and suddenly that number jumped to 50%. Now that might be depending upon what one means by the private sector. Now, are you including all these agricultural co-ops, which aren't really private sector? But I wonder if you get this new figure because, of course, the regime is unusually non-transparent. But if you look at the sort of the to and the fro's and these different numbers that are thrown out, if one could not surmise that, in fact, there are significant divisions within the government with regard to the desirability of the reforms, the breadth of reforms, the pace of reforms. Because when you see this sort of toing and froing and improvisation, that what could be seen as evidence of, in fact, significant divisions within the regime.
There certainly, Richard, the politics are happening in the Cuban leadership. Certainly, it's from the smallest PTA to to the Cuban nomenclatura. There are politics occurring, and there are disagreements. What I meant was, I don't know of any factionalism or dissension that has come out into the open. I don't know of any threat to Raul's hegemony. His hegemony is as great as Fidel's was during all of those previous years. At least that's my analysis. Now, but unlike Fidel, Raul, I think, is listening to a much broader spectrum of opinion and advice than Fidel ever did. And that is also, in my view, quite significant.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I thank the questioners for their excellent questions. Brian, there's a spot for you up front here.
Yeah, I want to get the mic off so I don't cough on you all.
We're going to turn to our panel now. After that very interesting presentation, each of our presenters will make a presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. Mark Wachtenheim is founder and president of the international consulting firm W International, founder and president of the Center for Freedom and Democracy, and a democracy activist. For a decade and a half, Mr. Wachtenheim has designed and led international development programs focused on building democratic institutions and local capacity in complex social and political environments, including as a staff member of the World Bank in 2 continents and on multiple USAID and U.S. State Department supported projects internationally. He will discuss various transitions from repressive regimes to freedom and offer some thoughts on the Cuba scenarios. Mark, you have about 7 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Roger, for the invitation, Jose, and for giving us this platform to talk about this issue, which in my mind is one of the most important political events that could take place first half of this century as far as politics in Latin America go. What will happen in Cuba? Not only is it important to 11 million Cubans that live on the island, but because Cuba represents half of this bicephalous monster with Cuba on one end and Venezuela on the other that exert a tremendous amount of influence on a series of countries in Latin America. What happens in the coming years in Cuba could play an extremely important role in the region as a whole. I think that Brian made several very important points. Some of them could be debated. I think that the most important point that I think we could all agree on is the last one that you made, that Raul is not to be underestimated. And I guess that's the comment against which I'll make my remarks now, and I'll try to be very quick. I'm going to talk about the future, about how to dismantle the type of oppressive regime, communist regime, like we have seen today in Cuba. And if we don't learn from history, then we're condemned to repeat it, as someone has said. And I think that history offers a great many lessons of cases that are comparable, that follow different paths, that were motivated by different purposes and that achieved different results. And I'm going to give several examples of that and see what light that sheds on what the future of Cuba might look like. The first thing I have to say is that there are a great many number of myths surrounding transitions from communism. A number of them even have some currency among people that focus on the future transition in Cuba and that follow Cuban politics today. Because of the limits on time, I'm only picking 2 to highlight now, but these are 2 that I've selected because they're so pervasive, but also because they're extraordinarily dangerous myths. The first is that a gradual approach to transition is the best approach. This was touched on by some of the questioners in the last presentation, but the argument goes basically something like this. The people who are currently in the government are those who know best how to dismantle the government, even though possibly a rapid transition would be desirable. It could create a chaotic environment, and it's too risky to pursue that option. One variation of this in the case of Cuba is that such a chaotic environment could even open the floodgates of mass migration, causing a large number of people hitting the South Florida shores. And this is a position that we to address this myth, I've looked at the close to 22 transitions that have taken place in the former Soviet bloc. These have been studied in depth, and there are a number of books that have been written by people like Anders Aslan of the Institute for International Economics, Fredo Arias King, Janos Kornai of Harvard, among a number of others, who have really looked very closely at these. And we can divide this block of countries into roughly 3 groups. The first are those who undertook serious, deep, profound democratic and free market-oriented reforms. And these are basically the Baltic states and the Central European states. And there's another group who basically sought to entrench and prolong their power through authoritarian means. And this is basically the Central Asian group of countries. And then there's a third group which undertook a gradual approach, limited reforms. And this is basically everyone else. Well, what a study of history shows is that those that did the best were those that pursued the aggressive, profound, rapid reforms. They had a window of time with which to do so, which was typically the first year or two after the onset of this transition. And it was in those countries that the reforms became irreversible, or much more difficult to overturn. And basically, there's not one example of a country that has suffered negatively from undertaking too radical reforms in terms of liberalization, stabilization, privatization, or democratic reforms. Now, interestingly, on the point of the chaotic environment and uncertainty that could be generated because of rapid change, in fact, the opposite is found to be true. It was precisely in those countries that undertook gradual transitions, where people became desperate, where there was more migration, where there were mass protests in some cases, and where there was societal instability and fissures. It was in the countries that undertook the rapid approach, the rapid transition, that people, I presume because they had faith in something new, something different, and some hope for the future, actually were peaceful and didn't mobilize and didn't emigrate as much. Myth number 2, economic reform leads to political reform. And we've heard different variations of this argument, but basically it goes something like this in the case of Cuba. We should support Raúl Castro's economic reforms because eventually they're going to lead to democracy. Well, both in the case of the former Soviet bloc and other regions of the world, we can find a number of examples of how this is actually not the case. We don't have to look too far. We can look at the case of China, for example, which nobody would question the degree to which they've undertaken market reforms, and yet I'd be hard-pressed to say that China is any example or model of democracy, human rights, or anything else like that. There are a number of other of the Asian tigers, of Gulf states, and certainly one can point to Russia today as well as an example of that. I think that the conclusion basically is that perestroika, or economic reform, doesn't lead to glasnost, political opening. And the takeaway from this is that both economic reforms, both market-oriented reforms, and political reforms are ends in and of themselves. They're not instruments to achieve one or the other of the two. And they should be pursued simultaneously. In fact, if anything, economic freedom is a subset, is just one aspect of a broader set of human freedom. Let's see, those are the 2 myths that I've pointed out. What can we take away from all of this? Well, the future of Cuba will largely be dependent on what motivates the future leaders of Cuba, what type of reform of these 3 different types that I've mentioned they'll want to pursue. And will they want to really undertake deep democratic and market-oriented reforms? Will they want to try to just simply consolidate authoritarian rule and prolong themselves in power, as a number of people, I think rightly so, fear? Or will they pursue a middle path of gradual reform through which an existing elite will then, through rent-seeking and other means, try to profit reasons to have hope for why Cuba will go down the ideal path of the three that I mentioned. And these are that Cuba shares a number of characteristics with those countries in Eastern Europe that undertook those rapid reforms. Very, very quickly, I'll mention them. Number one, one nation, national unity, despite the issues that Dr. Latell raised with regard to racial tensions. I mean, there's one sense of nationhood within Cuba. The high level of regime repressiveness. The higher the repressiveness of the regime, the more successful the countries did that undertook reforms. The existence of a civil society and alternative elites to those present in the government structure. Those are present today in Cuba. An active diaspora. This is extraordinarily important. The exile community that Cuba has abroad, largely concentrated geographically very close to Cuba, is playing an extraordinarily instrumental role in supporting the process of transition. Favorable geography, proximity to the United States, an important potential trading partner and market, and their history as part of the West. An economic structure which is not highly industrialized. Countries that did not have highly industrialized economies tended to do better as well in these processes of reform. And finally, and this is an important item that was in fact not present in the case of Eastern European transitions, the international community is ready. In the case of the Eastern European transitions, there were 22 countries that were undergoing the same process at the same time, or similar process. In this case, there's been time, we've learned lessons collectively from those experiences, and the international community, I believe, stands poised to be able to help Cuba. I will leave it right there because I've exhausted my time, and maybe can address some other points during the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that very effective use of your limited time. Speaking of active diaspora, we bring this to Francis Skrobaczewski, who is one of the innovators and operators of the enterprise funds that helped change the face of Eastern Europe by jump-starting private sector activity, first at the Polish-American Enterprise Fund and then at its sister entity in Hungary. Today, Mr. Skrobaczewski is the director of the U.S.-Polish Trade Council in Silicon Valley, facilitating linkages between Polish and U.S. high-tech businesses. He is also a director of the Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce. Francis will discuss, do you have any Afghan background, or you 132nd Afghan? We'll check. Understood. Francis will discuss the importance of empowering entrepreneurs as a central thrust of transitions to freedom. Francis, you have about 7 minutes.
Thank you, Roger. In 1989, when communism collapsed in Central and Eastern Europe, I thought it would soon follow in Cuba. 20 years later, we find a similar situation as what we found in Central and Eastern Europe in those days, and particularly with regard to the inefficiencies of the economy, risk-averse citizenry, and although some are entrepreneurial, we've heard a great deal about that earlier, the absence of business skills are rampant, and while there's capital, it's not capital that's available broadly across the board. So there will be numerous people who do not have access to the capital. Also looking to the transition, how that transition occurs, we know what happened in Central Eastern Europe, which is largely nonviolent. No one knows how it's going to happen in Cuba, as we were just hearing. What form will that take? How will it evolve? And that makes a big difference because the kind of institutions that are created in that transition period are influenced by how it occurs. This is a major unknown, and there are many other unknowns when the transformation gets underway. And one thing we do know from the experience in Poland, Hungary, etc., when it begins, there will be a collapse of the time frame. Things that took years to happen in a developed economy will happen very quickly over there, overnight almost. Some of it will be positive, some of it will be negative. But you think of it as their future is our past. Back in those days, there were a lot of challenges. You alluded to some of them because it was never attempted. There had never been a transformation from an economy to free markets. There were no roadmaps. But still, you have to deal with some of the specifics in Cuba. That is correcting the gross misallocation of resources, the vast social dislocation that will be underway, and that could get worse. We saw this in Poland and Hungary. In Cuba, you also have to deal with the vested economic interests, the military holding property, engaged in commerce. They're going to be hard to dislodge as competitors come along. You also have the weak institutions and the ecosystem, weak rule of law. These democratic institutions, political systems will be being developed and established. So there will be a lot of flex. The issue of property rights will be an issue. The kinds of laws and regulations, tax regimes that are put in place. And of course, the vested interest, and there are a few people who experience. As in Poland and Central and Eastern Europe, capital professionally deployed, like we did in the enterprise funds, was needed to fuel business growth. And it will be needed in Cuba as well to reach those segments of the economy that don't have access to capital from abroad. So critical to the U.S. strategy in Central and Eastern Europe were the enterprise funds. 1989 Congress enacted the SEED Act, providing for a Polish fund of $240 million, an Hungarian fund of $60 million, to promote development of the private sectors and policies and practices conducive to private sector development. So it was also a policy reform. That policy reform came from actually making the investments and influencing how policy developed. The hallmark of the enterprise fund was that capital was entrusted to an independent board and private sector professional management to execute. So what are some of the basic elements of that approach? Private sector vehicle capitalized with public funding to execute developmental mission. It was focused on business to business, and we had to act quickly to place capital in the hands of the local entrepreneurs on commercial terms, help them grow their businesses. And the realities were that investing ultimately drove policy reform. We didn't wait for theory to drive business activity, but it was the bottom-up building of institutions to support commerce. Sort of what Roger alluded to, in that Cuba needs to be, we need to help the Cubans create the Cuba that they want on their terms and the kind of objectives that they want to achieve. So Cuba could benefit from this kind of strategic approach. The enterprise funds were, in a number of cases, were very successful. Poland fund returned its money after 10 years. Bulgarian fund returned its money, left behind $400 million in Bulgaria in a foundation. But that's the financial returns were not the purpose. It was helping the local people develop their economy and their private sector. Capitalizing on the opportunities changing Cuba will offer, we will need to, again, move quickly to demonstrate help is on the way. Someone mentioned that the future will be better than the past, because this is a critical element in those early years. The Hungarian ambassador told me that when the U.S. announced the Enterprise Fund, that in Hungary, they thought someone's putting their money behind the talk, and that they really gave them hope. That's what carries them forward during those early periods, because those early periods are awfully difficult. You have to provide very aggressively to meet basic human needs. We didn't do this, I don't think, in Iraq. We went in, we celebrated, but the people were suffering, and they needed help immediately with water, the cooling, and so forth. I mean, they were suffering in the heat and the lack of food, lack of water, and so forth. So these are the kinds of services that need to be thought about well in advance, so that you don't have the local population saying we're worse off now than we were before. Evaluating in particular for Cuba, what are the necessary building blocks that Cuban society economy needs? That should have been begun a long time ago, so that we can hit the ground running. This is what we need to be doing today. That kind of strategy, not saying we're going to have this kind of material in this place and we're going to move this in at that particular point, but what are the building blocks? Again, starting small, looking for broad impact across the society to empower local citizens building businesses and creating that new middle class with a stake in political liberty. So looking at the big picture, what are some of the strategic fundamentals for post-Castro Cuban development as I see them? Private sector approaches are likely to be more effective than the government to government. You've got to get the private sector in, the Western private sector in as quickly as possible, and private sector models as quickly as possible. We have to provide direct opportunity for the mass of the little people that can have a lot bigger impact than building grandiose institutions. And those institutions take time to build. And also, addressing the needs of those little people may present less threat to vested interests, because they're not suspicious of them. They'll take them a while to catch up, but before you know it, they do catch up. People who own their own businesses have an equity stake in society, and that's what contributes to stability. That's what contributes to political liberty. And addressing the microeconomic factors can define the workable policy framework. We set up the first mortgage bank. By doing that, we took the risk that we could get some changes in the Polish regulatory environment. So we set it up, got the change, then kicked it off. And then the whole ecosystem for mortgage lending and home building built around that institution that we created. Bottom-up approaches like to provide faster and better results because systemic change takes time. And when you do it from the bottom up, that is what creates the system. Taking action and adjusting is more important and more effective than trying to create a perfect system. So let's get there, act quickly, do something, make some mistakes, adjust, but keep moving forward and trying to create the perfect system and then try to impose it so that helping the Cubans help build their own. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis. Dr. Teo Baboon is managing partner of Baboon Group Consulting, Inc. He is the author of more than 100 manuscripts and reports on Cuban businesses, infrastructure, and economic issues, including the Business Guide to Cuba, a special report dealing with current and post-transition business opportunities on the island. Dr. Baboon is an electrical engineer. He has an MBA and PhD in philosophy. We've asked him to address some of the challenges of reconstructing Cuba's infrastructure.
Thank you, Roger, Jose. Thank you very much. Before I start, I just want to recognize that the world's most knowledgeable person on Cuba's infrastructure is here, Juan Belt. So I want to make sure that, this is a marathon in 7 minutes of a lot of statistics. That's what I chose to stand up. I asked Roger if I may. Please stop me when I get to my 7 minutes. I'll try to go through as many sectors of Cuba's infrastructure as possible. As you know, Cuba's severely damaged infrastructure is in major need of rebuilding. They have an outdated electric grid that cannot supply the consumers and industry. Transportation is inadequate. Communication facilities are obsolete. And the sanitary and medical facilities have deteriorated very badly. There's no question that by providing assistance in these areas by the U.S. government and others, helping a Cuban transition government will meet a number of the challenges that they will be facing. In summary, some of the key infrastructure areas that I wanted to point to are that there are 10 international airports, 31 ports with cargo operations, up to 150,000 ton oil tankers can enter the port of Matanzas. There are 9,200 miles of railroad with the same gauge system as the United States, 21,000 miles of highway, 14 electric power plants that produce about 3,500 megawatt capacity. That give you that as an introduction. The ground transportation on the island is one of the strong points. There are 21,000 miles, as I said, of highway, of which 6,200 of those are paved highways and 7,300 miles have gravel roads. Now, having said that, there are only 800 gas stations in the entire country, of which 120 of them are in Havana. And if you have an opportunity ever to ride in any of these highways, you'll know in Cuba that there are very few of them have exits. And so that becomes obviously an opportunity. Some of the critical needs in the transportation system include road construction assistance, providing and facilitating training, technology transfer, and of course, helping Cubans start to build exits from their major highways. The air transportation, there are 6 international airports. I said 10 earlier. That's because they have converted some military airports already into commercial airports. The largest one, of course, located in Havana, and they handle 700,000 passengers a year. But perhaps, like I said, this is the Havana airport. As you see, is about 1,800, a capacity of about 1,800 passengers per hour. The biggest wild card, however, are the military airports because of the opportunity to convert them to international airports, therefore increasing substantially the amount of activity, international activity in Cuba. But as the others, there's a tremendous need for reconstructing the radar system, improving the operational procedures, upgrading the communication systems, bringing the airports into commercial compliance with ICAO standards. The seaports, one of the strong points in Cuba for the future, there are 70 ports in the island, 31 with cargo operations. 10 of those can handle, can be considered major ports. The port system can handle, in Matanzas, 150,000 metric ton. They do have some facilities for repairing and even building brand new vessels. They just built a number of tugboats for Venezuela. And as many of you that are familiar with this know that Odebrecht has a major contract to build rebuild the port in Mariel and convert it into a major container port. But like the other facilities in Cuba, tremendous need for port equipment, intermodal infrastructure needs to be looked at very carefully. And Cuba has a very unique opportunity in the transportation infrastructure, in that they have over 9,000 miles of track, of rail, that have the same gauge system as in the United States. The industry, they have 2 major lines throughout the country. They are in great need of improving the rail system to connect to the ports, technical assistance, and the like. And the last one I can touch on, because of the time, is water and sanitation. Cuba today faces daunting water supply and sanitation issues, including inoperative sewage treatment plants throughout the entire country. Water and sewer lines, the pipe network is in shambles in Havana and Santiago. In Havana, which is designed for a population of 600,000 people, now have over 2 million people. In Santiago, I can't begin to tell you. I think the system should have crumbled already. It's so bad. They need to provide capacity building, develop state-of-the-art water supplies, offer a huge amount of technical assistance in development, and there's a number of other things that is needed. I will not touch on the power and oil industry. We'll show you the pictures very quickly. But I will say one thing. Expect an announcement over the course of the next 30 to 45 days on the oil investigation that's taking place in the Gulf. I think we expected, because the hurricane season, the announcement will come before the hurricane season. And I think it will be the type of announcement that will surprise many because of the amount of the fine and the mortgageability that represents to the Cuban government. And I'll stop right there.
Great, thank you very much. Our next presenter is Dr. Javier Garcia Bengochea, medical doctor, MD, is a neurological surgeon who practices in Jacksonville, Florida. He is a certified U.S. claimant for property loss against the Republic of Cuba. He is also director of the Cuban Property Rights Initiative, an organization whose mission is to advocate for a fair and comprehensive settlement of the property expropriations in Cuba and the establishment of robust property rights as the central catalyst for strong economic growth and as the basis for the rule of law in Cuba. Dr. Garcia Bengochea will address the importance of property rights to the economic recovery of Cuba. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Roger. Yes, I am a medical doctor. I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm not a policymaker. I don't move the chess pieces or anything like that. However, I will say that as a claimant for property in Cuba, I wear a little bit of an unusual hat. I'm what I would call an uncertified claimant. Cuban exile. I was born but I'm a Cuban exile claim. But I'm also a U.S. certified claimant. Kind of the ironic twist to that is that though some of my properties represent claims in each category, so it's kind of an interesting straddling of the legal divide. So what are my qualifications to be here? There are lots of claimants. For the past 20 years, and really since 2008, I have more or less immersed myself into this issue. I have visited Washington on several occasions, met with lawmakers, policymakers, administration officials, legal experts on this issue. I've donated money to candidates on both sides of the aisle to learn about Cuba, talk to them, to understand where they might be on the property issue. So I have more or less received my degree from the street. But the undeniable fact is that I'm one of the people in this equation who have I had prepared a 3 or 4 hour Fidel-like talk, and I'll skip that and I'll put it on YouTube. You can see it there. But I'm going to cut to the main points. First thing I'd like to do is to kind of demystify certain elements of the claim. The claims and claimants in the past have always been viewed as Cuban normalization. In my opinion, they may be the biggest asset in the equation. The claimants in particular are labeled in one of two. This is the way I would view it. So this is a beginning. This is another Latipundista, Cuban exile who's here to get a settlement and get his money. I simply believe in fact, I would tell you in 2009, I spent more probably ever hope to recover settlement. And then the other is the look kind of that I received after the many legislators that here comes another right wing, white, exile wants to go back to their home in the Tony suburb of Miramar, throw out the 3 or 4 families with the grandmothers and the dogs and everybody out there. That also is in fact, arguably, pardon the metaphor, claimants are in the same boat as those people who live in those homes, occupy and work in those other places. We have been, in fact, the victims of bad faith. We're really kind of as well as others. The main point, when I go to Washington, I tell part of the solution. I think overwhelmingly, Cuban Americans all want in some way or another to be part of the solution. One of the main aspects. That I think needs to be clear from the outset. Rather than go through a history of the embargo as it pertains to actually that's on all sides of property. Cubans, to their credit, have always been 2009, probably hundreds of thousands of somewhere. Probably the most significant group, not necessarily in dollar value, millions of Cubans today. Several things that Brian Latell said. One of the reasons I would say that I'm here is because of the reforms that were made. For 50 years, there was this clear ideology, regardless of what was occurring in practical terms, that really kept this issue on the back burner. And with the recent reforms, you could look at this as a breach, if you will, in the ideological dam that occurred. And so the question is Raul Castro considered somebody who's totally dehydrated and needs a drink, and there's no water from the tap, and the bottles that come from the outside sources are empty? The only thing in front of him here is a fire hydrant. And he has to try to open that hydrant and get a drink. I think that these reforms, while nothing is irreversible, I think that they were to be reversed, come at a great cost to the government. There are a couple of things that have to be considered. I'll wrap this up and get to the main point. And I'm not going to talk about the embargo. There are mechanisms in place and the appropriate people who will deal with that under the appropriate circumstances. But the reality is that Americans want to go to Cuba and do it. And in many ways, they're much like the 16th century Spaniards. They didn't do it for gold, and they did something that new. The reality is that today, the protections that we expect that we have here or anywhere in the developed world simply do not exist in Cuba. Those are, in broad terms, contract sanctity, independent judiciary to resolve disputes, and of course, as importantly, transparent enforcement agencies. These are absolutely critical elements that do not exist in Cuba today. We call this, we would view this as a lack of the rule of law by our definition. And even if the embargo on those minimal terms were to be somehow lifted and only the U.S. claims were settled, every American, just as any foreigner, who unfortunately has jurisdictional protection, any American puts themselves arguably at risk of trafficking in property. It's an anti-American principle, trafficking in stolen property. It's anti-American any principle that we have that governs our societal and economic activities. The bottom line is that in Cuba today, there is no clear title to real property, brand, trademark, intellectual property. And all the things you've heard today from these excellent speakers is all contingent upon those protections in place. And they simply are not. I'm not going to propose mechanisms to resolve the property claims, but I'll just leave you with the point I made that, in effect, in my opinion, how these property claims are absolutely key to advancing the situation, at least economically, in Cuba, and I think probably politically too. This is a huge risk by the oligarchy in power today to accept these. Again, I think they have breached the dam, and the horse may be out of the barn in that regard. Then I would finally leave you with the notion there's been much excitement about the new Cuenta Propista, the private entrepreneur that's out in Cuba. Consider that person, like me, we are inextricably linked. Their future, their present, in fact, really the insurance to their success, the best predictor to their success will be how these claims are dealt with. And I would tell you that the claimants want to be part of the solution where possible. So I'll leave that thought with you and open up to the audience of this.
Very, very very good presentation and some thought-provoking observations. You know, we all talk about capital as an essential element for this. These folks have sunken capital. They have, potentially you could use it as a source for generating, for financing and all. Francis, as the doctor was speaking, I was thinking of some of what your observations that you've made in the past about, you know, you can't just sort of sit back and write the ideal property rights law or you know, come up with an independent judiciary overnight. But by empowering entrepreneurs and giving them capital, it creates a demand for these kinds of institutions. Could you give us, you know, one sort of example about how that's come about?
I like the example I used with the Afghans, because, you know, we think of Afghanistan as wild and woolly west, or woolly east, whatever. But commerce is taking place there every day. You know, people are buying and selling things. They have their system of doing that and their system of enforcement. And what I like to point out is what we need to do is legitimatize that, formalize it in different ways. And when you put in capital and help grow businesses, that begins to develop over time. But this is going on all the time. And in most places you have some kind of rule of law. You don't have the formalized rule of law. But it's essential to develop that capability, because as you say, property rights are the bedrock of free market. You will not have serious and sustainable lending, for example, or access to capital. That's exactly right. Without these certain protections in place. I think if you look at the exile community, who I think no one disputes will be a powerful economic driver, those people, like anyone else, like the Cubans in Cuba today, will want some sort of assurance that their equity, their sweat equity, is protected. All the way across the board. Across the board. Intellectual property, brands. And I will tell you, in response to what Brian said, I think that the extra-legal economy, black market, is absolutely enormous there. Absolutely enormous. And it's interesting because there has been a culture of kind of theft and fraud and corruption that has been inculcated over decades there. The Cubans, interestingly enough, do not perceive, I mean, it is necessary for survival. They don't have any ethical or moral issues with stealing from the state, who's subsidizing this black market. And now, because they're completely bankrupt, are trying to tap in to the economic activity that naturally exists.
Dale, do you have any observations about these?
Perhaps I just want to keep talking a little bit about how big of a problem it is with the corruption
Yes.
in Cuba. And I just a case in point, because I think that, again, I personally question the validity of Raul's sincerity in trying to deal with the issue of corruption. And here's my case in point. One of the things I track is shipping taking place in and out of Cuba. Mariel, in the Mariel area, is the largest cement plant in Cuba, and they have the largest deposit of gypsum in the Mariel area to feed that cement plant. Well, I've been tracking how Cuba has been buying gypsum from the Dominican Republic and bringing it in to feed the cement plant in Mariel. Well, that makes no sense whatsoever. You don't buy gypsum from the Dominican Republic, bring it to Mariel if you have your largest deposit right next. And as you go through it, you find that there's all kinds of people making all kinds of, the prices way overpriced compared to the market and so forth. If I know that, Raul knows that. And that's my point. I'm not aware, I'm not sure of the sincerity of, but I do understand that the corruption issue is huge in the country at that level.
Let's throw it open for questions to the audience. Be shy. Yes, please. In the back. Your name and affiliation, please.
Hi, Katie Keeley, U.S. State Department. Question to to the floor, whoever can answer it. Just wanted to see, when the fall happens, to what extent do you believe that the health of the U.S. economy will affect the efficacy of the private sector USG collaboration to support a post-Castro economic development in Cuba?
And I think one of the interesting things is that, you know, we have economic issues and huge fiscal deficit and all. The very idea, you know, I remember working on the Nicaragua transition. We put $300 million up against the Nicaragua transition in 1990. Basically, the stroke of a pen. President Bush was able to do that. We're not going to be able to do that, which I guess makes private capital all the more important in getting some of these things moving. So let me just throw it open. Mark, you haven't had an opportunity to intervene. What do you see the U.S. response now being to a transition as it begins in earnest in Cuba?
I think that's an excellent question. I think that there is an opportunity to undertake some planning, in fact, to be ready for that moment. That was an effort that was undertaken in earnest several years back. But times have changed, and I think that there was an opportunity to update and even develop more specific planning precisely for that. It's interesting, in 1989, 1990, the U.S. was undergoing an economic recession when the Soviet Union collapsed. And in fact, that did affect the ability, or the decision was taken to not expend a tremendous amount of government support, precisely because of that. However, I think that there's a lot of good that can be done from the international community. Certainly, there's a lot of good that can be done from both public sector and private capital. I think that the most significant determinant, though, to the ability of Cuba to overcome its infrastructure and employment and inequality and social services obstacles is unleashing the entrepreneurial spirit of the Cuban people. I think that what stifles that economy isn't the lack of investment from abroad. In fact, we know that there is a lot of investment from other countries, that including the U.S. It's suffering as a result of the burdensome overregulation that a socialist, communist system imposes. And yet we know that the Cubans are extraordinarily entrepreneurial. We know that from what they're able to achieve when they do have economic freedom. So it seems to me that the smart businessman, even in the context of a recession, if there's an opportunity to go in and contribute, and if the rule of law is in place, and if private property rights are respected, and if there's no such abhorrent, nefarious system as is existing today with slave labor, which is another reason, in addition to the lack of rule of law and private property rights, which I would say makes foreign investment almost unconscionable, not almost, makes it an unconscionable act, because the foreign company that's operating in Cuba isn't able to hire Cuban workers directly and pay them a fair wage for their fair work. They rather have to go through a Cuban government employment agency that pays the worker in turn a very small fraction of what they're charging the foreign company. I think that's a long answer to it.
No, those are good points. Those are excellent points. Any others care to comment?
Yeah, you're right on point about the recession in 1990, early 90s. President Bush went to Hungary and Poland and gave speeches on a $10 million fund for Hungary and a $40 million fund for Poland. He came back to Congress, upped it sixfold, because they recognized that's what it would take. And this was a critical need. In Afghanistan in the late 90s, my friend Don Ritter was advocating money for Afghanistan, former Congressman Don Ritter, didn't get it, didn't get any support. How much did that cost us? So you have to do the smart thing with your money. And again, it's leveraging the private sector in whichever way you can. The U.S. government in 1990 leveraged quite a bit with the enterprise funds to put up some money. That money wasn't spent. We didn't spend that money for a decade almost, because we kept recycling. It was the same money. And the authorization was at the beginning, but we didn't even draw it down until the end. So that money went to very good use, and it leveraged and brought in private capital then, because we created we took the risk, demonstrated the opportunity, and help set up some of the ecosystem. So then private money rolled in. We raised, my colleagues in Poland raised $2 billion. And that's what allowed them to give the money back to the U.S. Treasury. So you have to do the smart thing, and not just the thing we've done time after time after time after time again. How much have we spent in Haiti? And what have we gotten out of it? How much have we spent in these other places? In Iraq, they set up a $646 million program to make work and gave it to a consulting firm. With $646 million, we could have had an enterprise fund that would have created businesses that would have created jobs. They were doing make work and they had to shut it down.
Yeah, and I think that what we should be trying to achieve is property, not programs. The problem is the bureaucrats who are allergic to the enterprise fund concept. They want to be able to manage a contract and have a contractor who takes over all the accountability and responsibility. And part of that's there's no tolerance for any kind of risk. And we ask, how can we have such a flat curve of mutual trust with the Pakistanis? It's because we have hundreds of millions of dollars, we think, or they think, sitting around that isn't being moved because we're afraid of taking any sort of risk with this money. And we're waiting for the perfect program to come across someone's desk in Washington, and it's created an even deeper deficit because people think that we don't want to help them. It's just, I think that our bureaucrats are out of ideas and they don't know how to help them. And so I think these kinds of exercises and what Ray Walser is doing at Heritage and what they're doing at Brookings, Dr. Feinberg put a report out in November on this subject, really essential. And there's so much goodwill, really, for the Cuban people that I think it will make an awful lot of difference. This kind of private wellspring, people that have skin in the game, has to be part of the transition in Cuba if we're going to make it happen. Question.
Hi, my name is Sonia Schott with Global Vision Venezuela. I was wondering what the panel think about the role Latin American could play in the future of Cuba, considering what happened or having in mind what happened in the last summit of the Americas, which Cuba was considered like a point of friction between Latin America and the US. If the reforms will take place, do you think that this is going to bring Cuba closer to the US and far from Latin America, or what? Thank you.
Well, I think our president had it right when he said there's going to be Cuba at the next summit, because hopefully it'll be a free Cuba. But I think he had it right. But all of these people in Latin America, I hope they have some sympathy for Cubans and not just the Castro brothers. And there will be this wellspring of support. But what do we think? Will Cubans, this is an essential and it's an important question. Do we think Cubans on the island understand that the United States has made a decision, a conscious decision, not to do business with the repressive regime, and that instead we're going to use our leverage to bring about deep and broad and irreversible political and economic reforms? Do we get any? Do we think that we have a good sentiments between us as people, precisely because of that, and will it have benefits in the long run? Dale, you want to take a shot?
You're asking the wrong person, because we're very close. I mean, as you know, we also run a program for DRL and for USAID, have been running Cuba transition programs for 13 years and are very close, have a very large network in Cuba and talk to the Cubans all the time. And I would say this, Roger, and I'm embarrassed to say it, I think that the Cubans in general are not political. They have become removed from the, and perhaps because of the lack of information, the problems that they face every day, and the emphasis on trying to feed their family and take care of their needs every day, that they have become apolitical, literally. And they are happy to tell you that they're not political, to the point that you introduce them to an issue like freedom of religion, for example, and their comeback is, no, we can't deal with that because we're not political. Well, that's not political. That's your freedom. That's in the Declaration of Human Rights. And no, that's political. And so this is, my experience is, I can't answer your question because I haven't heard one Cuban that I have talked to, the many Cubans that we talk to, with some exceptions, that those that get exiled.
Well, I think I asked precisely the right person then. But I think I hijacked the question too. What about Latin America, the role of Latin America in Cuban transition? Please. You can talk from there.
I think it's an excellent question. And as somebody who has Latin American roots and as somebody who has grown up in different countries in Latin America, I'm very sorry to say that I think that Latin America has had a blind eye and has had a very responsible position towards Cuba. I think that the recent Summit of the Americas is an example where the members of a club of democratic nations that purportedly uphold a certain set of democratic principles in order to be able to be members of that club, rather than try to lift up Cuba and other countries to the standards that your organization is meant to uphold, want to lower the standards to be able to accept countries that are clearly not democratic. Cuba is the only country in the hemisphere that has not had democratic elections, as imperfect as the other countries' elections have been. So I think that was a missed opportunity for a number for Latin American countries to show their solidarity with the Cuban people. The only thing that I can think of to explain that is the fact that I'd say that the Latin American left has woven the tapestry or the narrative of imperialism on the part of the United States that has nothing to do with reality. I mean, it's not an empire, but unfortunately that narrative sort of freezes the left into, it turns them into being blind to defend the violations or defend the victims of violations of human rights in those countries like Cuba, like Venezuela, and so many others that the left supposedly is meant to defend. So I think that in fact the relationship is sort of in the other, can go in the other direction. Not so much, unfortunately, what Latin America can do for Cuba, but possibly what Cuba, a future free Cuba, will do for Latin America. Who would have said 20 years ago that the 10 new members of the EU are the former Soviet bloc countries? Not only that, but that they're outperforming in economic terms and some other indicators some of the old members of the EU.
I have time for one more question, Jose. We're actually gone over a little bit, but I'll ask.
Teo, my name is Jose Cardenas. We all remember, obviously, the early 90s and the explosion of conferences related to Cuba's impending transition, private sector, tremendous amount of corporate interest in Cuba. I think they're probably seeing a bit of an uptake in interest in Cuba from a corporate perspective. And I was wondering, Teo, when you move through those circles and conferences or in your interactions, do you sense that people interested in Cuba economically have any sense of the points that Javier made about the very complicated situation on the ground in terms of property rights and questions of title to properties, et cetera, that should be, one would think, as a private sector representative entering a new market, that would have to be pretty high up there among your concerns. Once you get someplace, all of a sudden, boom, you're hit with a lawsuit or whatever, or soon thereafter. What have you found in your interactions?
That is a very important question, Jose. And may I ask you to move 3 slides forward, because I think I'm going to use a case in point. One more. right there. Stop right there. That is a plant in Santiago de Cuba, and I'm going to make that as a point for you to perhaps to answer your question. That's an operating plant. It exports cement, bag cement to the Dominican Republic primarily, and provides cement throughout Oriente. It has its own port. It has its own gypsum deposit. It's a self-containing cement plant. It's the second largest cement plant. The Spaniards have gone into that plant and have tried to buy it without regards to the ownership. The Colombians have gone in and done the same. The Jamaicans have gone in, and the Swedes have gone in and done the same. There are at least 5 different corporations from around the world that have gone in to operate that plant and to want to own that plant without regards to the ownership issue because of the strategic position that that plant has. And I can tell you that there are various companies in the United States that have expressed an interest in that plant as well as others. I think the answer to your question is this. In the early 90s, when after the fall of the Soviet bloc, we were approached by perhaps 1/3 of the top 500 companies in the United States. And I think till today, there's a tremendous interest by U.S. companies to want to go into Cuba. Very few of them ever ask questions related to property rights and issues like that. Their interest is strategic, competitive, and I think it's up to us, perhaps, to provide the lessons and the teaching that takes place for them to be very aware of the dangers of not doing and not looking at this in this area because of the potential problems. Most companies still see Cuba today, out north of Okeechobee Lake, most companies see Cuba today as if it was Costa Rica. They just don't get it about Cuba, in my opinion.
I want to thank you very much for the panel's presentation and for your excellent questions, and for Dr. Latell's excellent, insightful opening. I would just say a couple of things that jumped out at me. Number one, Raul, comes back to Raul. Raul's 80-year-old sidekick, brain trust, middling bureaucrats who are sort of helping him muddle through this. And I hope that you're right about the reforms being irreversible and meaningful. I think that remains to be seen. But one thing that jumps out at me is if he is all-powerful and is undisputed, he could do more. And why doesn't he do more? And that, I think, brings us back full circle. But eventually, we'll be able to see the great potential of Cuba. You see Florida has its economic problems. You see this extraordinary dynamism, however, in the community you now call home, Miami. And I think it's fair to say that it is what it is, not because it has a good mayor or a good governor, but because of the people there that have an opportunity to grow and to invest and to build a better life, businesses for their families, precisely because they aren't overly regulated and because it's not a top-down kind of an arrangement. Well, thank you very much for the panel's excellent participation. Thank you very much for your